Arleyn SIMON. I was first interested in archaeology when I was very young. We had a great natural history book that talked about findings of the caves in Europe with the artwork and the people living in caves in Paleolithic times. And I also grew up on a ranch and wheat farm in Montana, and we had teepee rings and on the pastures, and grew up where there are a lot of Indian tribes, so I had a very early interest in learning about all of that. I went to high school in a small town in northern Montana, and went on to Montana State University, where I was an art major with a minor in secondary education, but I took all the courses for essentially a double major in anthropology. But at the time, I didn't think it was really possible to have a career in that, so I hadn't switched majors. Then after that, I taught art at a small town in Wyoming for a couple years, and decided to go to graduate school in anthropology at Oregon State. And I got a master's in interdisciplinary studies with art. Archaeology, anthropology was the major, with minors in art education and education philosophy. Then later on, I worked for the University of North Dakota, running an archaeological field station in the western part of the state for 5 years. And then we moved to Arizona so I could go to PhD graduate school at Arizona State University. At Arizona State, I was an archaeology grad student, North American archaeology, and for my language was actually quantitative studies, statistics, classes in the math department. And my dissertation was on the ceramics of Shoofly Village, site that had been lived in the 10 to 1200s in just below the Mogollon Rim, with a lot of planewares. I joined SAA as a graduate student at, I'd actually attended an SAA in Minneapolis when I was living and working in North Dakota. And then when we moved to Arizona, I joined SAA. And my last year of graduate school, the SAA was in Phoenix. And one of my professors, Sylvia Gaines, was the program chair, and I was her assistant program chair. And Mary Carroll, another graduate student, was another assistant program chair. And it was the very first time that the SAA submissions and programs had been done on a computer database, pre-Windows. It was interesting. I think we were using RBase on an AT computer, and mostly we used the ASU mainframe at the time, but this was a PC-based database where we were able to enter all the participants and the sessions and the titles of the papers, and then print out strips for each session, and then arrange them all on a big board to work it out. And one of our goals was to make sure that we didn't schedule similar topics at the same time, so they were spread throughout the conference so that people could attend all of them. But of course, SAA was much smaller back then. This was in the late 80s. My professional career started out in the Northern Plains. My master's thesis at Oregon State was on experimental archaeology, where I was working with some ethnographic accounts of making Blackfeet pottery that James Griffin had described as conflicting and therefore didn't make any sense. And my study of it, I thought there's actually two methods they're talking about, and one of them was utilizing a hollowed out space in the ground to make a mold to make pottery and then firing it in the ground. And the other method was using a rawhide mold to make flaring flat-bottomed pots. So I used local clays from Montana and made some experimental pots and fired them and wrote that up. And as the rawhide molded pots were similar to what was called intermountain ware, and even though we don't think of pottery in the plains, there's actually some small pottery pieces found from Alberta down through Montana and Wyoming. They're not well fired, and generally just a few pieces of the rims preserved, but that could have matched this ground mold technique, and that was published in Archaeology in Montana. And then when I worked in North Dakota, Larry Lohendorf, a professor at the University of North Dakota, was my boss, and we started an archaeology field station in western North Dakota called Undar West. That's University of North Dakota Archaeological Research. And we were working in the North Dakota Badlands, and this was during the oil boom of the late 70s and early 80s. And when we started work there, I think there had only been about 3 or 4 sites recorded. And after the 5 years I had been there with our student crews working, we had recorded 1,200 sites and done some of the first test excavations and one of the first major excavations in the Badlands. Those were primarily mobile hunter-gatherer sites where they were moving through the Badlands, and we'd find a local fired clay that was called porcelainite that had been made into expedient tools, and also Knife River flint when peoples were moving from the Missouri River west. And we excavated one site called the Marsh Hawk, which had successive layers from early archaic time up to the late prehistoric. So it was a prominent point just before you descend to the Little Missouri River. That was a very exciting site to work at. Then later on, after I moved to Arizona, I got involved in Arizona archaeology, first up around Payson with my dissertation in the Central Highlands, the pre-classic period, and then right when I graduated from ASU in 1989, we started the Roosevelt Platform Mound Study, and I directed the lab and the analyses for that. We spent 4 calendar years in the field, a very large Bureau of Reclamation project on the Tonto Forest, excavated 120 sites, including 6 large platform mounds, and analyzed over 600,000 ceramic pieces. Took us 6 years to write up all the reports from those excavations. And then when that finished, we got a contract with the Bureau of Reclamation to curate all of the Roosevelt projects at ASU. And I was the curator of collections and directed what we called the Archaeological Research Institute for over 20 years. And we employed a lot of graduate, undergraduate students who worked with the collections and learned about material analysis and cataloging, and served on a lot of student committees, and I just retired last year. Well, my research interests in some ways changed during my career, and in other ways sort of carried on. Starting out in the Northern Plains, I was interested in all the tribes and prehistoric peoples that had lived up there, and worked on bison kill sites and done a lot of lithic analysis, settlement patterns, all of that type of thing. But as an art student and art teacher, I had gotten involved in making ceramics. So my thesis was on the sparse ceramics of the Northern Plains, and when I went to Arizona, I concentrated on ceramic analysis, but the previous knowledge and skills I'd gained making pottery helped a lot in my ceramic analysis to understand techniques and methods that were used on the prehistoric pottery. But of course it changed to dealing with settled agriculturalists in the American Southwest, living in villages, still doing some hunting, but kind of broadened out into that realm. Important milestones in my life, I guess, were going off to college and being able to explore a lot of different topics, and realizing that it was possible to do archaeology and pursue those interests. I have been very fortunate to, in my graduate training, I went to 3 different universities in 3 different states, and had the benefit of learning from that many different faculties, which I think really gave me a broad background in cultural anthropology as well as archaeology, and I think both are very necessary to be able to interpret and understand the past. And also the issues, many of the issues are relevant still today. I was very fortunate to get a job in cultural resource management through the University of North Dakota first. I really liked working in the university environment where the emphasis was on research, and I had the opportunity to train and work with students and help them along in their careers. And then going to Arizona, we thought we'd only be there for a few years, but just opportunity that the Roosevelt Project started up just as the time I graduated. That was a marvelous, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to be involved in such a large-scale, research-oriented project for 10 years, and then to carry on working with the data from all of those projects and help other students and researchers get involved in it has been very gratifying. When I started out in archaeology and anthropology, there were very few women professors. There were a few in Oregon. Well, at Montana State, I actually only had 2 professors, very small, in sociology, anthropology. Both were men, but very open-minded about women going on. And I was fortunate to be able to obtain these research jobs. I never felt there was any prejudice against women, and I guess growing up in a rural area of Montana and on a ranch and farm and all of that, I was used to operating around men and with men, and so I never felt that was a holdback. I think there has been some pay inequities over the years, but I don't really feel that I had any real setbacks or prejudices that I had to deal with. Some difficult things were maybe disagreements over archaeological methods and approaches to research, and my colleagues and I dealt with those with articles where we tried to counter whatever was being thrown our way, and I think that's the way of scientific research, to try to be objective and state your case of what you feel are the underpinnings and the justifications for the approaches that you're doing. I've had many mentors throughout my career. As an undergrad at Montana State with only 2 professors in the sociology department, Les Davis had a great knowledge of Montana archaeology and also the ethnographic record, and Tom Roll taught courses in all 4 fields of anthropology, which gave me a great broad-based methodological as well as theoretical background for my career, and encouraged me to go on to graduate school. And at Oregon State, I studied with Tom Hogue and Court Smith, who were cultural anthropologists but had great mentorship of writing effectively and research design, and Dave Bronner, who was very knowledgeable of archaeological methods and theory. At University of North Dakota, I worked for Larry Lohendorf, and he was terrific, giving me great latitude of running the Undar West Field Station and designing projects and carrying them out with the students that we hired to work on those. At Arizona State University, my advisor was Chuck Redman, who's terrific with research design. I had professors in the math department I learned statistics from. Barbara Stark and Sylvia Gaines were also on my committee, and terrific mentors in archaeology and statistical analysis. I also had material scientists on my committee. And then I've just worked with a lot of wonderful colleagues over the years, including Glenn Rice at the ASU Office of Cultural Resource Management, was very knowledgeable of CRM, genius at planning projects and budgeting them and carrying them out effectively, very knowledgeable of Southwest archaeology, and all of my other colleagues that I worked with there over the years. I've had many colleagues that I've worked with over the years on all these projects. In North Dakota, I worked with Larry Lohendorf, of course, and Jeannie Borchert at Undar West, as well as Dave Keene, and many of the forest archaeologists in western North Dakota. In Arizona, the Roosevelt Project, I worked with Glenn Rice, who was the director of Office of Cultural Resource Management, and I worked with Glenn for many years on many projects, and he's a wonderful colleague to work with, very knowledgeable of the Southwest and research design. And Chuck Redman was on that too, Owen Lindauer, David Jacobs, and I. And Mary Carroll designed our first database for the project. Since then, I've worked with a lot of people in other fields, three-dimensional scanning, worked with Gerald Farron, who was one of the brilliant computer scientists that developed a lot of computer-aided design at ASU, and a group called PRISM, the Partnership for Research in Spatial Modeling. I've worked with a lot of people that do compositional and studies in geology, chemistry, other colleagues in the different government agencies. While at ASU, I've done a lot of projects with the Park Service where I've had students go out to parks and help the park with curation or recording historic features, things like that. So that's all been very rewarding to have a very wide network, even beyond archaeology, to work with. I would hope that some of my contributions to archaeology have been in understanding sites in parts of the Northern Plains and also in Central Arizona, particularly ceramic analysis and analysis of undecorated pottery, which in the past got very little attention, but tells us a lot about local traditions and site interactions, cultural continuity, exchange between local villages. I think with the students that I've worked with, I've tried to encourage them to pursue the areas and interests they have, but I hope I've given them some guidance on research design and also how to effectively gather data and work with it and interpret it and use it for testing their theories about what is going on with the prehistory. Archaeology today is a very successful field in terms of how many archaeologists there are, but we face some real challenges going forward. During the years I've been in archaeology, since I was an undergrad, the field has grown tremendously. The numbers of academic departments have grown tremendously, but I think that's somewhat reached a saturation point a long time ago. And there are other careers outside of academia that I think should get as much or possibly even more emphasis to be successful in the wider society. There are many people who work for government agencies, and government agencies right now are facing a lot of challenges in trying to uphold the many preservation laws that we have and try to keep those going forward to protect our knowledge of the past and preserving and interpreting our cultural heritage. With government programs in archaeology, the days of big archaeology projects starting way back in the 1930s with the WPA projects and then the Smithsonian River Basin surveys and then the birth of cultural resource management in the 70s and the development of big government infrastructure projects that supported a lot of research. We are not seeing that happening in the last decade or two. It's really shrunk. The support for the parks has shrunk. So there's a real need to be advocates for, along with replacing and renewing our national infrastructure, we need to be advocates for supporting the laws, the preservation regulations to protect our cultural heritage, and also have positions for archaeologists in those government agencies and in the private sector. My hopes for the future of archaeology is for us to do more and better communicating with the public of what the goals of cultural knowledge and cultural learning are for the country and for the world. And we are seeing so many processes go on around the world and in our own country of people being affected by poverty, by economic inequality, by food insecurity, by having to move to respond to social, economic, even fear of their lives, pressures. We see this with Central Americans coming in waves of families to the U.S. for a better life, and the diaspora across Europe from Syria and North Africa. So the challenges that face humanity have always been there and will always be there in the future, and we see so much of it in our satellite instantaneous broadcasts around the world. But anthropology and archaeology should have a real voice in helping people understand what is going on and trying to find solutions for those things. When we did the Roosevelt Project, it was a great adventure in team research, and there were other contractors with other teams working in the Tonto Basin as well. And we did have some group meetings and sharing of information, but it was just a time of great learning to have the federal funding because of the modifications to Roosevelt Dam to be able to explore all these large platform mound communities. And the amount of archaeology we got to do in those 4 calendar years of excavation was beyond what one could hope for in an entire career or 10. So there's a real benefit to being involved in big joint projects, not just with your fellow colleagues, but also with research-minded people in the agencies that design these things. And we saw all sorts of weather extremes, from extreme drought years where the lake and the cacti pretty much dried up, to extreme floods to where the water was within a foot of going over the top of the old Roosevelt Dam, and with the spillways wide open, and we had to use a pontoon boat to float the crews across to get to the sites to excavate. So we had many adventures along the way, as well as the scientific learning.